The sea does not recognize the difference between a warship and a target. On the afternoon of December 17, 1927, the United States submarine S-4 was running a submerged measured mile trial off Provincetown, near the tip of Cape Cod. The water was calm, the visibility was clear, and the temperature was freezing. On the surface, the U.S. Coast Guard destroyer Hiram Paulding, CG-17, was making way at speed in the height of Prohibition, hunting for rum runners. The geometry of the collision was absolute. The submarine broke the surface into the destroyer's track at close range, with only seconds for either ship to react. The steel bow of the Paulding struck the submarine on the starboard side, opening the pressure hull and tearing into the battery room. The physics of such an impact are catastrophic. A submarine relies on the integrity of its pressure hull to maintain buoyancy and exclude the ocean. When that seal is broken, the vessel becomes a stone. Hundreds of tons of seawater crashed into the battery room, destroying the electrical systems and adding instant, fatal weight. The S-4 did not glide to the bottom, it fell. The boat slammed into the mud at about 102 feet. The stern was flooded, dark and silent. The men in the aft compartments died instantly or drowned within minutes, but in the forward torpedo room, the watertight bulkhead held. Inside that steel cylinder, 6 men remained alive. They were trapped in a space built for machinery, cold, shrinking, and bleeding heat into the Atlantic. Lieutenant Junior Grade Graham and Fitch took command. Power was gone. Light was gone. What remained was a finite atmosphere and the one primitive channel that still worked, steel struck from within. In the era before underwater telephones or rescue beacons, the hammer was the only transmitter available to a trapped crew. Sound runs about 4 times faster in water than in air, and the steel hull becomes a giant diaphragm. Each sharp strike drives a shock through the sea, something a listening ship or even an ear against the plating can pick up. Slow, punishing, and brutally physical, it needs no power, only the strength to keep hitting frozen steel. In Maritime Salvage, nothing sounds more desperate. On the surface, the realization of the disaster was immediate. The Paulding stopped, lowered lifeboats, and marked the spot. The Navy mobilized a rescue fleet from Boston and New London. When the first rescue ships arrived over the site, they shut down their engines and listened. Rising from the dark came the rhythmic, metallic clanging of the men below. The taps were deliberate, counting out a number, 6 men alive in the forward torpedo room. The tapping became a wire strung through 100 feet of black water. Simple questions could be sent back, by answering on a hull or by a diver rapping directly on the plating, and the men inside would reply. That is the paradox of this disaster. The victims were not missing, not silent, but in contact with the people trying to save them. Newspapers across the country reported the fragments of these taps. Lieutenant Junior Grade Fitch tapped out a question that later accounts would preserve as a permanent part of salvage history. He did not ask about food or water. He asked about the one variable he could not control. His message was simple. Is there any hope? According to several contemporaneous reports, the answer, drafted on the surface under Captain Ernest J. King's authority, came back. There is hope. Everything possible is being done. But hope is not a strategy, and physics is not sentimental. Inside the torpedo room, 6 men were breathing a fixed, sealed volume. With every hour, oxygen fell and waste gas rose. The rescue fleet was gathering, but the sea was already turning. What began as a collision response was becoming a race against 2 clocks, the metabolic limit of 6 men in a steel box and the weather window above them. The S-4 was sitting on the bottom, waiting for a solution that had to be invented on the fly. The clock inside the forward torpedo room was not measured in hours, but in partial pressure. While the hull remained watertight, the 6 men were consuming their limited atmosphere. This introduces the specific mechanism of their peril. Carbon dioxide buildup. In a sealed environment, humans do not simply suffocate from a lack of oxygen. They can also be overwhelmed by their own exhalations. As the men breathed, carbon dioxide crept into the low single digits, where breathing becomes harder and judgment begins to fail. At higher single-digit percentages, unconsciousness can follow quickly. Whatever absorbent measures existed aboard were limited and could not keep pace. The survivors were trapped in a shrinking envelope of breathable air, and the rate of decline was accelerating with every exertion they made to signal the surface. The rescue ship Falcon arrived and set a heavy moor over the wreck. Down on the bottom, the hull sat in darkness at just over 100 feet, deep enough to put every move on the edge of complex diving physics. To reach the survivors, a diver had to descend, find the plating by feel, and try to connect an airline to the submarine's fittings. If it held, the surface crew could push fresh air down and buy time. But the barometer was falling fast. Wind rose, decks heaved, and the sea turned into a field of white water. Despite the weather, the Navy launched the divers. Chief Gunner's mate Thomas Edey was among the lead divers, locating the wreck and helping establish the downline. He confirmed the hull was intact but reported that the wreckage of the superstructure was a tangled hazard. He surfaced, and another diver, Fred Mickles, was sent down to make the final connection of the airline to the survivors. Mickles reached the deck of the submarine, but as he worked to thread the air coupling, the heaving of the surface ship jerked his lifeline. He was thrown into the jagged metal remains of the collision damage. Salvage crews have a word for what happened next: fouling. A diver lives on his tether, lifeline, and air hose running up to the surface. In a wreckage field, those lines can snag on torn plating, cleats, or debris, and once they bind, the bottom owns the man. He cannot ascend. Struggle only tightens the trap. Mickles was pinned to the wreck at depth while the storm raged overhead. Cold water seeped into his suit, and exhaustion began to climb. Thomas Edey, who had already completed a dive and was resting, realized the situation. He suited up again. This decision involved a severe physiological risk involving the concept of the bends. When a diver breathes compressed air at depth, inert nitrogen gas dissolves into his bloodstream and tissues. The deeper the dive and the longer the duration, the more nitrogen is absorbed. If the diver ascends too quickly, the pressure drops and the nitrogen comes out of solution as bubbles, blocking blood flow and causing paralysis or death. By diving twice in rapid succession without a long surface interval, Edey was saturating his body with nitrogen to a dangerous degree. Edey descended into the freezing black water. He found Mickles trapped in a web of steel and twisted railing. For hours, Edey worked with a hacksaw and wire cutters, sawing through the wreckage that held his shipmate. It was a brutal physical contest against the friction of the water and the drag of the current. Edey eventually cut Mickles free and brought him to the surface. For this action, Thomas Edey would receive the Medal of Honor. But the victory was partial. Mickles was alive, shaken, exhausted, and lucky to be breathing. The storm intensified. The waves became so violent that they threatened to smash the Falcon's support vessels. The airline that had been so painstakingly connected to the submarine finally snapped under the strain. The rescue fleet was forced to retreat to the harbor to avoid sinking. The connection to the 6 men was broken. Inside the torpedo room, the tapping stopped. The carbon dioxide concentration climbed past the lethal threshold of 7%. The cold and the gas finished what the collision had started. The rescue phase was over, and the operational logic changed in the same instant. In its place came a colder imperative: recovery, examination, and answers. The Navy determined that the S-4 would not remain a tomb. It would be raised, examined, and dissected. This decision put Captain Ernest J. King in charge of the effort, with Lieutenant Henry Hartley commanding the rescue ship Falcon, driving the hard salvage work. They were no longer trying to save lives. They were trying to save the future of the submarine service by understanding the failure. The mission parameters changed from a sprint to a siege. The engineering problem was massive. The submarine lay deep and half buried in mud, weighing hundreds of tons more than its displacement because of the flooding. To bring it up, the salvage team could not simply hook cables to deck fittings and pull. The structural steel was built to resist external pressure, not the localized stress of a deadlift from above. If they hauled from the top, they risked tearing the boat apart and destroying the evidence they needed. The solution required a complete change in geometry. Instead of pulling from the top, they had to lift from the bottom. The plan called for cradling the hull in a series of heavy lift chains, creating a sling that would distribute the weight evenly. These chains would be attached to surface buoyancy units, known as pontoons. However, the S-4 was not sitting on a clean, rocky bottom. It was impacted deep into the clay and silt of the ocean floor. There was no gap under the keel. To pass the chains, the divers would have to force their way through the seabed itself. This defined the scope of the operation. The mission had already shifted from a sprint to a siege, and now that siege would be fought in weather windows. Off Provincetown, the site was exposed to the full fetch of the Atlantic. Captain King established a rigid routine: hold station as long as the sea allowed, retreat to harbor when the gales hit, repair, and return the moment the wind dropped. Every delay was paid for in cold steel and lost ground. For the divers, the conditions were punishing. The water hovered near freezing. They worked in standard canvas suits with little thermal protection, and the bottom offered no light, only pressure and touch. They were not just visiting a wreck, they were building a construction site around it. They cleared debris, mapped the hull by feel, and prepared the ground for heavy rigging. And before any pontoon could lift an ounce, the divers had to do the impossible job first: make space where none existed, and work their way under the steel belly of the submarine. The operation dragged on for 3 months. It became a test of endurance for the surface crews and the divers alike. Every day was a cycle of freezing spray, rough seas, and the slow, grinding progress of the underwater work. The tragedy of the lost crew hung over the site, but the sentiment was compartmentalized. The focus was entirely on the mechanics of the lift. Captain King drove the schedule with an iron discipline, knowing that if they did not raise the ship before the spring storms, the mud might claim it forever. The preparation was complete. The fleet was assembled. The only thing standing between the S-4 and the surface was the solid wall of mud beneath its keel. The salvage site was a trap. The submarine was embedded in clay, suction tight, with no clearance under the keel. Chains could not be passed around a hull that had sealed itself into the bottom. To make a path, the divers would have to cut the seabed open by hand. The divers named the method like a job title: tunneling. It was manual excavation under a wreck, driven by a water jet from a heavy hose. Pumped water scoured clay into a choking suspension, carving a narrow path beneath the hull. The nozzle kicked like a weapon. The diver had to brace against the wreck or lie flat in the mud just to keep from being driven backward by his own tool. The work on the S-4 took place in total darkness. As soon as the lance struck the bottom, the water became a thick slurry of silt and clay, reducing visibility to zero. The divers worked by touch alone. They had to carve a curved tunnel under the keel, large enough for a man to crawl through, yet small enough to remain stable. This was the most dangerous location on the entire site. The diver was effectively digging his own grave beneath 1,000 tons of unstable steel. If the tunnel walls collapsed, or if the submarine settled even an inch, the diver would be crushed or trapped. The cold was a constant physical antagonist. Down there, the water was barely above freezing. The divers worked in short shifts, hands numb inside heavy canvas mittens. They lay on their sides in the muck, guiding the roaring nozzle into the gloom, washing the spoil back past their bodies. It was exhausting, claustrophobic labor. They had to cut 6 separate tunnels spaced along the length of the hull to accommodate the lifting chains. Once a tunnel was punched through from port to starboard, the process of rigging began. The divers could not simply push a heavy chain through the hole. They started with a thin pilot wire. A diver on one side would feed the wire through the blinding cloud of mud, hoping it would emerge on the other side where a second diver was waiting to catch it. Once the connection was made, the pilot wire was used to pull a heavier cable, which in turn pulled the massive lifting chain under the keel. The chain was then cinched tight against the hull, biting into the steel plates. They repeated the cycle until every chain was threaded under the keel. The winter storms continued to batter the surface fleet, frequently forcing the support ships to disconnect their hoses and run for shelter. The tunnels would silt up during these delays, forcing the divers to re-excavate the same ground when they returned. It was a punishing rhythm of advance and retreat, but slowly the web of steel was woven. The chains were set in place, cradling the submarine at its strongest structural points. The hull was no longer held solely by the suction of the mud. It was now gripped by the salvage gear. The foundation for the lift was complete. The divers had done their work in the dark and the cold. Now the operation turned from muscle and mud to buoyancy. The chains could cradle the hull and spread the load, but they could not create the lift. That energy would come from the salvage pontoons, massive steel buoyancy engines built for the job, not improvised drums or rubber bags. Each was an immense steel cylinder sheathed in wood for protection, capable of generating about 80 tons of lift. The physics of a pontoon lift are treacherous. The cylinders are flooded with water and lowered to the bottom, where divers shackle them to the lifting chains. Once secured, powerful air compressors on the surface pump compressed air down into the cylinders, forcing the water out. As the water is displaced by air, the cylinder becomes lighter than the surrounding sea. It begins to pull upward. The science is simple, but the control is chaotic. The danger lies in the expansion of gas. As a pontoon rises, the water pressure around it decreases. The air inside expands, displacing even more water and increasing the lift force. If this acceleration is not managed, the pontoon can shoot to the surface like a missile, potentially snapping the chains or crashing back down onto the wreck. The salvage master must balance the air pressure across 6 separate pontoons, ensuring the submarine rises on an even keel. On the morning of March 17, 1928, the final stage began. After weeks of brutal seas and forced retreats, the surface finally gave them a narrow, workable stillness. The salvage fleet formed a tight cordon around the site. Hoses were connected, and the compressors began to hammer. Slowly, water inside the steel cylinders was purged. The tension on the chains increased. Deep below, the S-4 was fighting the grip of the seabed. The suction of the clay was estimated to add hundreds of tons of resistance to the dead weight of the hull. The pontoons strained against this hold. The chains bit into the steel plating. For hours, the battle was invisible, fought entirely by the gauges on the air manifolds. Then the mud surrendered. The suction broke with a sudden release of energy. The surface of the ocean began to boil. Massive bubbles of expanding air erupted from the depths, churning the water white. Then the blunt, rust-colored noses of the pontoons broke the surface. They breached like surfacing whales, foaming and rolling in the swell. Between them, cradled in the web of chains, lay the battered hull of the S-4. The submarine had returned to the world of the living. The lift was not a gentle process. The boat hung suspended below the pontoons, a dead weight swinging in the current. The salvage crews moved quickly to secure the rig. They had to tow this unstable assembly all the way to the Boston Navy Yard. The submarine was still full of water, heavy and sluggish. The tow was a delicate operation, requiring the tugs to move at a crawl to prevent the drag from snapping the chains or destabilizing the pontoons. But the engineering logic had held. Captain King and Lieutenant Hartley had gambled on a slow, methodical siege rather than a hasty snatch, and the gamble paid off. The S-4 was no longer a lost cause on the bottom of the Atlantic. It was a recovered vessel. The physical recovery was complete, but the grim purpose of the mission remained. The hull was towed into the dry dock, the gates were closed, and the water was pumped out. The ship settled onto the blocks, revealing the damage that had killed it. The time had come to open the hatch and confront the answers inside. The salvage engineers had finished their work. Now the medical officers took over. When the hatch to the forward torpedo room was finally opened, the air inside was stagnant and heavy. The compartment told a final story about the 6 men who had waited for rescue. Accounts described them found where they had last endured, on the racks and on the deck, still and quiet. Whatever panic had come and gone in the dark, the end was silent, a slow losing battle for breath. Later examinations and the pattern of the tapping supported what rescuers feared during the storm. The compartment's atmosphere failed. The decline was fast, mechanical, and merciless. Oxygen falling, carbon dioxide rising beyond what the men could endure. The taps faded, then stopped as strength and consciousness ebbed away. This finding stripped away any ambiguity about the loss. The tragedy was not an accident of nature. It was a technological gap. The Navy possessed the ships to find a wreck and the divers to reach it, but it lacked a reliable method for men to escape a pressurized hull on their own. The death of the 6 men on the S-4 became a catalyst for a radical shift in submarine doctrine. The public outcry and the cold facts of the autopsy reports forced the naval bureaucracy to prioritize individual escape. The direct result of this disaster was a hard new urgency. In the late 1920s, Charles Swede Mommsen and the U.S. Navy pushed escape breathing gear out of the experimental shadows, with operational testing following by 1929. In the early 1930s, the rescue chamber, a diving bell designed to mate with a submarine's hatch and ferry men to the surface in groups, matured from concept to fleet hardware. The S-4 was raised, examined, and later returned to limited service and testing, helping prove the procedures and systems that would save future crews. The men who died in the torpedo room did not survive the collision, but their loss forced the creation of the safety infrastructure that defines modern submarine operations. The legacy of the operation is not just the steel that was raised from the mud, it is the decision to treat submarine escape as an engineering problem rather than a stroke of luck. The tap signals from the hull, asking if there was any hope, were answered too late for the crew of the S-4. But the industrial response to those signals ensured that for the next generation of submariners, the answer would be different. The salvage of the S-4 proved that the ocean could be fought, the depth could be conquered, and the dead could be brought home to teach the living how to survive.